Well, as we continue to move forward here through the segments that we had at the Believe in Our City event here recently, one of them was with Jonathan Eig and with Jamelle Bouie. Jonathan wrote a book on Martin Luther King and really dove into who he was, his history, and what gave him the moral courage to do what he did. And he also digs into all the people that were around him, that helped him and that supported him and that were part of a movement that was so transformational, so important for our country and for so many people in our country. And it's a wonderful discussion back and forth about how we can learn from the life of Martin Luther King and really start to apply those learnings in our own life and start to understand why he had the impact that he did, the lasting impact that he's had, and what that means for us today and into the future. He had a strong belief system, and so when we talk about things we believe in,
we believe and have always believed
that.
In this country that man was created in the image of God.
A wonderful job.
He was given talent,
getting that out on the table,
was
and
instructed
so
to use them
it's a great conversation.
to make this world a better place in which to live. And you see, this is the really great thing of America.
It's time to discover what binds us together, and finding it has the power to transform our world. That's what I believe. How about you?
Hello. It's funny, we've done this before, but we're not going to do like a routine or anything. I have new questions for Jonathan this time.
They were hard last time. Are they going to be harder this time?
I hope so.
Good.
Okay. So first, thank you for having us. King of Life it really is a remarkable book, a very exhaustive biography of King. And the thing that struck me, the first time reading it, and really just beginning it, is there's basically a small library's worth of books on King available. And they cover pretty much all aspects of his life. So my first question to you is, what motivated you to pursue this kind of comprehensive biography, knowing that there's already all this material out there?
Well, first of all, thanks for the question, and thanks for having us here today. I think with every titanic figure in American history, you need a new biography, at least for every generation, because the story changes, our understanding changes. And one of the things we've seen happen with King in the last 40, 50 years or so, certainly since the national holiday was created, we've seen his message watered down. We've literally seen him turn into a monument. And when you turn someone into a monument, you very often run the risk of forgetting that this person was once flesh and blood. And in the case of King, when that happens, we tend to choose the stories and the pieces of King's legacy that make us most comfortable. And one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, well, first of all, because there were still hundreds of people alive who knew King, and I realized this would be the last chance to write a biography of King. And there hadn't been a biography of King since 1982. There have been hundreds of great books, but not a straight, cradle-to-grave biography. I wanted to write a book that would make you cry at the end, because you felt what this man's journey was like and how difficult it was. But I also wanted to put some flesh back on that bone and remind people just how radical he was, how religious he was, how much he struggled with issues of mental health, things that we kind of sweep under the rug when we celebrate Mr. Reverend Dr. I Have a Dream.
Right. The book is titled King Alive, but so much of it, to this point, deals with the people around him. And those are the parts that I found so interesting. You are working from materials that no one had access to before, and from people around him, including from his father and from Coretta Scott King. But then also, so much of the book is dealing with other friends, family, allies, even adversaries. And so my question is, in taking this approach and really kind of going into the people around King as much as King himself, it seems to me that you're trying to remind readers that you really cannot understand this guy separate from a very specific, not just historical context, but like social context as well.
Absolutely. There's a criticism of biography, and a lot of historians tend to poo-poo it because the idea is that we only tell the stories of the great men, and it's almost always men. And in fact, several people didn't want to talk to me for this book. Diane Nash in particular wouldn't talk to me because she said there's too much attention paid to King already. And I tried to make the argument that King is kind of the vehicle. People want to hear about him, but I can use that opportunity to write what I think is the best treatment we've ever had about Coretta Scott King. I am bragging a little bit. There hasn't been a Coretta Scott King biography yet. There should be one. In the meantime, I think my book is the best portrait of her that we have. And the same thing is true for Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr., whose story is just American. It's a saga that there should be operas about Daddy King. Born into sharecropping, one generation out of enslavement, and raises this child who can change the world, gets to see his son win the Nobel Peace Prize. This is epic stuff. And Daddy King had written a memoir, an autobiography that was never published. There are only 2 copies in the world. The King children didn't know it existed. The King Center in Atlanta, the King Institute at Stanford didn't know it existed. So I'm finding new ways to tell the stories of the lives around King, because you can't understand, just as you can't understand America without understanding King, you can't understand King without understanding how he was shaped by his father, his very difficult relationship with his father, who beat him, and his very interesting and challenging relationship with Coretta Scott King. Coretta Scott King was an incredible woman who really pushed her husband time and time again. In fact, I make the argument that the reason King fell in love with Coretta is that she was more of an activist than he was. I interviewed a bunch of women who dated King, sometimes at the same time.
This is actually a very funny story from the book. It's like my favorite story from the book. King is he's graduating from seminary. Or he's graduating, I think it's seminary, right?
Yeah.
And his family and friends are coming, and also like several women who are like, he's gonna get engaged to us.
They all think that they're engaged.
Right. And so he is telling a friend of his who he had dated that, can you help me avoid these other women who think I'm supposed to be engaged? I think it's very funny because it's very sitcom-y. It's like a Three's Company episode, but with Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, it is. It's always funnier with King. When you hear his pickup lines, they're just funnier because they're Martin Luther King. He met this woman in Shaft Cafeteria in Boston, and his line, he walked up to her and says, I see you don't like beets either. That's Martin Luther King using that beets line, It's like, wow. But my point, I had a point here, is that he's dating 3 or 4 women in Boston at the same time. They're all beautiful, they're all brilliant, but he picks Coretta because she is an activist. And he hasn't done anything yet. She's been involved in all of these protest movements, and she's been to the Progressive Party National Convention. She's recommending books that she thinks he needs to read. She says, I found these tapes that she made right after the assassination of her husband when she went to work on her book. And again, I think I'm the first writer to have access to these tapes. And she says in these tapes that, it was a bunch of jive, these lines he was using when they met in Boston. But she challenged him. She said, okay, so you're going to be the guy who kills Jim Crow. Great. How are you going to do it? Have you read this book? Have you read that book? And I think that's what attracted to him. And she continued to push him. She's pushing him when he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. Coretta says, what are we going to do now to expand our mission? Because this provides us an opportunity. It's Coretta who's speaking out on the Vietnam War before her husband. So I think part of my argument to the criticism of biography is that you don't focus on just one life. You have to, see how that life is shaped by others.
And there are other elements to this as well. One of the things you emphasize as you discuss the Montgomery bus boycott is how much King is a vehicle for the activists in Montgomery, that it's not King going to Montgomery and kind of like organizing this, but the people already organizing their resistance to Jim Crow, saying this is a guy that we can use.
That's right. And that gets into what we've heard so much this morning already about the power of the community and looking around and saying, what are we doing? What can I do? Because the power is already there. When King gets to Montgomery, women, it's mostly women, like Joanne Robinson, Rosa Parks, have been building this movement and thinking about when they're going to protest and how they're going to protest. And when Rosa Parks gets arrested, the movement begins. Before King, in fact, when they call King and say, will you come to a meeting? Because we're thinking about this might be the moment to finally boycott the buses. King's reaction, these historic words, were, I'll think about it. He wasn't sure he wanted to be involved. And he thought about it, and he decided he had to be involved. But it's because so many others had already built the platform, built that network, built the community up to the point that they were ready to challenge Jim Crow. And they found their spokesman in King. but he wasn't looking to lead, and they weren't necessarily counting on him to do it.
And he does struggle with this notion of himself being this kind of leader. This isn't, I think in our imagination, we sort of see him as someone who took on the job of leadership without any real conflict or question. But as you show, it was difficult for him. It was very difficult, very trying for him, and wasn't something that he was necessarily comfortable with throughout his career.
Yeah, this is one of the things I love about King, is that he's overcoming his doubts constantly. We think of him as, this is one of the tendencies of history. We're viewing it from the past, so we think, well, he was always Martin Luther King. He was always meant to be this leader. No, he didn't want to be a leader. He was hoping to become a college professor someday, and maybe the president of a university, Morehouse, would have been probably his top choice. And in fact, he applied for a job while he was working in Montgomery in that first year. He applied for a job at Dillard University in New Orleans and might have received that job, except that the church renovations weren't done yet, so they had to postpone their hiring process. So one of the things I love is that King faces these challenges over and over again. He gets thrust into this position of leadership in Montgomery, and suddenly this turns into a national movement, and people begin to say, now we need you to help us spread this around the country. And he actually writes to one of his college professors and says, I'm 27 years old and they're expecting miracles from me. What do I do now? What if I've peaked? 27 years old. And yet every time he faces one of those moments, he responds by stepping up. He's at the age of 30, he's stabbed in the chest by a woman in Harlem. And his wife and his friends are saying, this might be time to step back, let someone else lead a little while. It's dangerous. And he's also at a period in his life where things aren't going that well. His attempts to expand on the Montgomery bus boycott are meeting with failure over and over again. This is another important thing to remember. King fails, probably more than he succeeds. We know about Birmingham, and we know about Selma, and we know about Montgomery, but we don't talk about St. Augustine or Albany, places where Chicago, where he could objectively be judged a failure. But he keeps going. He keeps trying over and over again. And I know I would have quit several times along the way.
Yeah, I want to double back on that point about failure, because it is the book, precisely because it's such a detailed and methodical look at King's career. You really do impress upon readers both the sheer difficulty of trying to do a Montgomery-style event in other places, and how just small changes here and there, for example, in Albany, the leadership there, the city leadership just decided they weren't going to confront them.
Right.
Just simply saying we'll kind of let this peter out was enough to confound King. So you're showing how difficult it was to accomplish things, but then also when he was successful, showing how much that did rest on really like titanic collective efforts of many different kinds of people. So I guess the question here is like, how did the failures sort of shape King's relationship with those other people who would then help build the successes? Like, what was their perception of those failures?
It's so interesting, and I'd love to get your perspective on this too, Jamelle, because when we see him failing, and really from like 57 to 61, 62, there's not much that he can hang his hat on and put on his resume. But what's happening during those years? We've got the student lunch counter sit-ins, we've got the freedom rides, and King isn't really involved in those things, but he's helping when he's asked. So here he is, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, the most important figure in the black community, the most respected protest leader we have, and yet he's taking a back seat. In some cases, he's not even taking a seat. He's literally not getting on those buses. But he is learning from those other activists, often younger activists, because now he's 30. He's an old man. And the younger activists are saying, he's finished. He's our father's generation of protesters, right? Like, but he's listening, and he's learning, and he's changing as he goes along. And when he's needed, he responds. So when they ask him to come in support of the freedom rides, he's there. When he's asked to come in support of the lunch counter movement, he's there. And when he's ready to go into Birmingham, again, responding to the call from the people of Birmingham, in particular Fred Shuttlesworth, and his allies are saying Birmingham is a disaster. We don't want to go there. It's far too dangerous. His response is, I have to try. And he's absorbing lessons from these younger activists, and he's showing us willingness to listen, to work with other community leaders, which is really rare, I think, for somebody of his stature.
Just to my thoughts on this is what I find so interesting is that the way you've portrayed King, he's not by any means like an accidental activist, but he seems to have been someone who was both leading but also as like acting as a catalyst for activism and events already happening across the South. That sort of the success of Montgomery sort of was a sign to Shuttlesworth, to like people across the South. Hey, this is a thing that you can do. It's possible. And then once that gets going, King enters like this kind of relationship where he has been a catalyst for other people who then say, oh, this guy can be very useful to us as a spokesperson, as someone who has the ear of the president, and can work for us in that way. And so there's this very kind of push and pull relationship happening between King and the movement. And I think it's like a really interesting way of presenting the movement, because I think it presents the movement less as how I think we tend to think of it, which is a top-down, almost like hierarchical thing, and much more fluid and much more democratic and much more grassroots in being pushed from below more than anything else.
I think that's a great word for it, catalyst, and I think it's really worth thinking about what that means in King's case, because he's criticized for being the Lord, as the younger activists call him, this figure on high, but he's aware that all of those people who are working out there and criticizing him, all the people who are doing the grassroots organizing are critical, and that it only works if they do that work, and he's not going to get any credit for that. But he also recognizes that by coming in and basically serving as this catalyst and being willing to just blow things up, knowing that, part of what's going to happen is chaos, that he might go to jail, which is not like a publicity stunt. As a black man in the South, going to jail had serious consequences. You did not know if you were going to come out. And yet, he knew that he would draw the focus of the nation, he would draw the media, that the president might have to respond, and that's exactly what happens in Birmingham. And that's why it's so successful, but only after it fails several times. When he gets to Birmingham, literally the most important black preacher in town doesn't show up at the airport to meet him, and King says, oh, okay, we've got a problem. This is not what I expected. And they run out of people to get arrested. Only when they recruit children to get arrested does it finally capture the nation's attention.
Which was a very controversial decision.
Very controversial. Malcolm X said it was too radical for him.
Yeah.
And King is aware that he's got to blow things up sometimes. And that's an incredibly bold, and again, I make the argument that in many ways he was more radical than Malcolm X, because to take those kinds of chances when your name, your reputation, and lives are on the line is incredible, but he felt like that was the only way he was going to move the needle, the only way he was going to get the government to take action.
I think this gets to one of the ways that King does exist as a symbol today, and that is unfortunately often as like a cudgel, right? Very often, deployed to say your protests are too disruptive, they have to be more like King's, et cetera, et cetera. And as you've just described, and as you show in the book, I think very conclusively that this notion of King of not being disruptive or chaotic or transgressive even is completely false. It's sort of us misremembering what happened.
Yes, and there's a tendency to try to conservatize King. And King was conservative in some ways. He believed the government was the best solution for some of these problems. And he was willing to work with the government, which is partly why he was so widely attacked by folks like Malcolm X and sometimes by Stokely Carmichael. But on the other hand, we have really forgotten just how radical his message was. And you hear people saying all the time, you're right, invoking King to say that, oh, well, King would never shut down a highway and protest. He shut down highways all the time. Or King would be opposed to affirmative action because he said we should all be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. Well, no, the king was explicit in how he felt about affirmative action, and he was very much for it. But we run the risk, which is another one of the reasons why I want to write this book, of just taking the parts of the King's story that make us most comfortable and forgetting how much he challenged us.
Right. And to that point, other than this slice of time after the '63 March on Washington, which really was in its moment kind of understood to be a big deal, King was very unpopular throughout his career.
Yeah.
Extremely unpopular. I think, well, I'll say this. Why do you think it's important for readers to grapple with his unpopularity?
Well, first of all, yes. First of all, even in '63, 70% of Americans were opposed to the March on Washington. Think about that. And then it only gets worse for King as he begins speaking out more on issues of economics, as he begins speaking out on the issues of the Vietnam War. His popularity falls. 2/3 of all Americans in 1966 said they disapproved of Martin Luther King. Not that they disapproved of his stance on anything. They disapproved of him, period. 2/3 of all Americans. And I think that it's important to remember that people are powerful. People make change because they make us uncomfortable. That if all we do is preach what our audiences want to hear, we may be popular, but we're not going to merely make change. And I think that's the key. And that's what King had to embrace that. He had to accept his own popularity. And one of the interesting things is that we can read his reflections on this because the FBI was recording his calls. And one of the great ironies, the FBI actually stepped up its surveillance after the March on Washington. There's this memo from William Sullivan, the assistant director of the FBI, to J. Edgar Hoover, saying, given King's oratory yesterday at the Mall on Washington, we must now consider him, if we have not already done so, the most dangerous man in America when it comes to race. And that's because he threatened the status quo. It's not because they thought he was a communist or that he obviously wasn't going to blow things up. He was going to blow up the existing power structure, and they did not want to let go of the good thing that they'd had for so long. But one of the interesting side effects, the FBI was surveilling him in an attempt to destroy him, to break up his work, and to literally to encourage him at one point to commit suicide. But the fascinating side effect is that now, when we read those transcripts of King's phone calls, they have the effect of humanizing him. And we can read his conversations, the transcripts of his phone calls with his closest friends and advisors, where he says, I feel like no one's listening to me anymore. I don't understand why the press is being so unkind to me. What am I doing except calling for an end to war? Why is that wrong? And even some of his friends are challenging him and saying, maybe you should back off. Maybe you should just stick to voting rights in the South. That's where you're most effective. You won't make as many people angry. It'll help our fundraising efforts. And King has to say to his closest friends, don't you know who I am? Don't you know why I do this work? I'm not trying to do what's going to make me popular. I'm trying to do the right thing. And for King to have to say that, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah. It's just as an interesting tidbit. It's worth saying, right, that at the time that King is so unpopular and being surveilled by the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover is one of the most popular public officials in the country, which is just sort of a remarkable kind of turn of historical reputation. These days, J. Edgar Hoover rightfully we're this is a bad guy.
Yeah.
And King is a hero. And I do think that is sort of it's a reminder of how history's judgment can play out in ways that you cannot anticipate. And so the important thing is just to, especially for someone like King, is to simply kind of commit to the work that you're doing.
That's right. And he knew who he was. He always said that he wasn't an activist. His activism was an extension of his work as a minister.
Right.
And his job was to save souls. And when he was presented with this opportunity to become the leader of a movement, he recognized that he had the ability to speak to a larger congregation, the congregation now becoming the nation and the world. And he took that really seriously in a way that is hard for us to imagine these days, when that kind of faith, not just in God, but in anything, seems so rare today. But King just doubled down on his faith, even when his closest friends were saying, maybe you don't have to embrace everything Jesus said, King is saying, well, yeah, I actually do. And he's willing to suffer for it.
So one of the things I found interesting about sort of the latter half of the book, the latter part of the book, kind of towards the end of King's career, is how there are these new kinds of movements popping up. There's Black Power is emerging. There's a much more greater militancy in the wake of these victories. 64 Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act, they're powerful things, but they're kind of, as much as they are progress, they also reveal how much is still left to do. And in response, there's a lot more militancy. But King never, and correct me if I'm wrong here, King never condemns the militancy. He's always sort of trying to be in dialogue with people who are more radical than he is, more confrontational than he is.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And at the same time, the media is starting to criticize him more, and white Northerners are saying, listen, we've done enough. Look, we gave you those pieces of legislation. We gave you the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. Stop pushing. Don't be so needy. And King is refusing to back down, and yet others, more radical, younger leaders are saying, it's time to go past, it's kind of time to leave King in the dust. We've got to take a more aggressive stance. And King is engaged in speaking with them. One of my favorite stories is when he goes down to help finish the Mississippi March after James Meredith is shot. He and Stokely Carmichael are marching through Mississippi together. And they have these great conversations. You can tell that Stokely is falling in love with King. Like, he expected to find this older, fuddy-duddy, conservative, but he's really comes to admire King. And they're having these conversations where Carmichael is, on this march, Carmichael is starting to try out the phrase Black Power. And he's using it to great effect. The audiences are loving it. And he's having these discussions with King about why Black Power is a phrase that really captures the moment. And you should try it, Dr. King. It's really powerful. The audiences really respond to it. And King says, I'm not going to say Black Power because it sounds like it's suggesting violence. And I understand the importance of using the term black. It's more popular than Negro as we're making these changes. And power is definitely something I'm in support of, but Black Power together just sounds violent. I'm not going to say it. And Stokely's, just try it. You like it. And King, they have this really respectful discussion, and you start to notice King does use black a lot more than Negro in the next few weeks and months, and he begins using the word power a lot more. He won't put them right next to each other, but he's learning. And he's learning even, and I think appreciating a lot of what Malcolm X has been saying all along. And one of the things I discovered in my research, we have this famous quote from King. It's the longest interview he ever gave in Playboy magazine, and he's asked what he thinks about Malcolm X. And he says in the printed version of this interview, I think Malcolm X's fiery demagogic oratory brings nothing but grief to Black America. And I requested the transcript of that interview with King from Haley's archives and found that Haley made up that quote. When King was asked what he thought about Malcolm X, he said, listen, I don't think I have all the answers. I certainly don't condone anyone who calls for violence, but I think Malcolm and I have a lot in common. We're both fighting for black dignity. And the magazine changed the quote. So that's another example, not just of King's open-mindedness and his willing to work across lines, it's also an example of how the FBI's attempts to divide and conquer the civil rights movement were effective, and that King never really even realized how effective the campaigns against him were.
Yeah. We have to wrap up a little soon, so I wanted to ask you, we have an audience here that is thinking hard about how to make change, and we've been sort of talking about King's relationship to the movement, to the community, to his own sense of being a leader. What do you think that people can take from King's story, from the story of this movement in terms of how to not just organize for change, but actually make change and turn that into something effective?
That's a great question, and King was willing to try over and over again. He comes to the north, he moves to Chicago, my town. He actually moves into Chicago. One of the things he realizes is that he has an ability to shine a light on problems, that if he comes to Chicago, even if things don't go great, the media is going to notice, the world is going to notice, and he's willing to take those chances. The other thing that I think it's really important to remember about King is that no matter how much he was under attack, he continued to believe in working across lines, and he believed that he could hone a message that spoke to everybody, that he could get people who were, and this is so important today because we tend to, I think Doug used the word silo, we stay in our silos. King did not believe that there were silos, and this is why he rises to fame in Montgomery, because he can speak to North and South, or at least he thinks he can. He thinks they should all listen, because what is he preaching? He's preaching the Bible and the Constitution. What could be more American than that? And if he keeps reminding people that this stuff might sound radical, he might be calling for things that you disagree with politically, but it's all rooted in his love for America. He's not trying to tear down the country. He's trying to make it better. He's trying to help these people who've been excluded to join the greatest democracy on earth. And he believes that message of hope and optimism. And this guy who was arrested 29 times, stabbed in the chest, surveilled by his own government, never lost hope in what this country could be. And I think that, even when he was unpopular, that shone through, that feeling of hope and optimism.
I think it's a great place to end. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.